Do you ever stop and think about what your life will look like 5 years from now? What will your life look like 5 years from now, spiritually, relationally, financially, physically? 5 years from now, will your spiritual life be closer to God? Will you have a sense of closer intimacy with God, or will you be adrift in sort of doubt and uncertainty and, well, lukewarmness? 5 years from now, relationally, will you have a couple of really good, strong, deep friends, or will you have few, if any, and the ones that you do have are a negative influence on you? 5 years from now, if you're married, will your marriage be strong and intimate, or will you be full of bitterness and on the edge of divorce? 5 years from now, how will your life look financially? Will you have built a more solid financial foundation where you can then be not just covering your basic bills, but generous to the charities and nonprofits that you want to support? Or will you be struggling just to pay the bills, living paycheck to paycheck? And 5 years from now, what will you look like physically? Will you be in better health? Or will you weigh more and struggling to do the basics of caring for your own physical body? All right, when I think about my life in 5 years from now, it gets really concrete. My oldest son, Micah, will be graduated from high school and going on to college. And my youngest son, Sam, will be beginning to drive a car. I mean, 5 years from now, our finances are going to be hitting the fan. 5 years from now, spiritually, will they be prepared to continue to become the people that God has created them to become, feeling close to God? Relationally, will they have a better relationship with me at that age than I had with my dad at that age? And when I think of myself physically, I already kind of consider myself an old man compared to them. In fact, they picked up lately calling me their old man. I mean, will I be able to keep up with them in 5 years from now? What do you think your life will look like in 5 years from now? Who is the 5 year from now you? Now, there are many things out of our control, all kinds of external things. I mean, you could be in a car accident. You could have some diagnosis that completely changes your life. But there are a lot of things that you have in your control. And I can predict with a high accuracy what your life will look like in 5 years from now. The habits you have today will shape who you become tomorrow. The habits you have today will shape who you become tomorrow. You look like your parents when you're born, but you look like your habits when you die. Your habits over the last 5 years created who you are today. And your habits over the next 5 years will create who you are in 5 years from now. Do you like the direction your habits are taking you? Let me ask that question again. Do you like where your habits are taking you? You see, intentions don't create change. Habits do. So today's message is this: you in 5 years. Now let's stop for a second and talk about a question. Put your answer in the chat or turn to your neighbor and let's discuss. Describe one thing you'd like your life to look like in 5 years, spiritually, relationally, financially, or physically. Let's talk about it. Today we are wrapping up a series called The Power to Change. And this series is an experiment in a bigger series of series on the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus' most famous teaching in the book of Matthew. As we've started this new year, we thought it would be helpful to focus on what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Just say a simple, yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. A lot of us are trying to say at the beginning of the year, yes, I will. So how do we do that? And we've been trying to help you through this series. Now, Paul, one of the first missionaries of the church and the author of many of the books of the Bible, tells the Galatians this in his letter. Don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So let's not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Don't be misled. Don't be stupid. Don't try to mock God. God can't be mocked. Paul's words here are really strong. He basically says there's only two options. The first option is that you're going to reap destruction and death. And the second option is that you will reap life and eternity. If this seems heavy, it's because it is. Like, where do you want your life to go in 5 years from now? In 10 years from now? 20? 50 years? What direction are your habits taking you? Real and lasting change isn't just behavior modification, it's spiritual transformation. And if it's going to be spiritual, then we have to start with your spiritual identity. Like, who you think you are determines the kinds of things that you do. You do what you do because of what you think of you. And so we started with the spiritual who, your identity. Your core identity is that you are a beloved child of God. But then we moved on to your spiritual why. Those are your beliefs, the reason behind what you do. And then your spiritual what? In other words, your habits. Who you're becoming is a reflection of your habits. Now there's a positive side to habits and a negative side. So then we turn to our spiritual whatnot. Based on who you want to become, what's one habit you need to break? Last week we looked at your spiritual how. You got to stop trying, and instead you need to start training. And today we are looking at your spiritual impact. How you live is who you will become, and the impact that you will have on those around you. One thing we're going to talk about today is the law of sowing and reaping. And this law is always true, except I have a little footnote for it because it's kind of like the law of gravity. The law of gravity is that if you lift something up and let it go, it will fall down. Except that it's not really falling down, like it's falling towards something of a greater mass. So yes, it's a law, but there's also some caveats to it. All right, so here's what we mean when we talk about the law of sowing and reaping. First, you reap what you sow. Second, you reap more than you sow. Third, you reap after you sow. Now here's the caveat, okay? Here's the footnote. That not everybody sows in the same soil. Some of us have more challenges in life than others. Some of us have unjust structures working against us that we have to overcome. Some of us have been hit by disasters or things outside of our control. And so the soil of our life is pretty rocky. It's got a lot of clay in it. It's not very fruitful or fertile. C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity talks about this in terms of two factories. Like, you can think about factory A. Factory A has old equipment. It's all just about breaking down. It's barely like working, but somehow a really great manager in that factory continues to, well, make things happen, but just barely. And then there's the second factory, or factory B. And factory B has all of the latest like high-tech gadgets. It's got all the bells and whistles. It's brand new. It's got all the resources, but it has an incompetent manager in it. And yet, because it has all of those good things, all of that top-notch gear, it produces more than factory A. Now, Lewis is using a metaphor here. He's saying like people are like factory A or factory B. And he makes this conclusion. That's why Christians are told not to judge. We see only the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material. But God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. All right, let's take a minute and stop and give you a chance to talk about this law of sowing and reaping. What do you think of this law of sowing and reaping? In other words, you reap what you sow, you reap more than you sow, and you reap after you sow. Let's talk about it. All right, we're gonna dive deep into this law of sowing and reaping. So the first part of it was you reap what you sow. If you plant an apple tree, you don't get grapes unless you have an AI image generator that'll create an apple tree that's producing grapes. If you plant godly habits, you'll reap, well, godly results. Now, the opposite is also true. The prophet Hosea puts it this way, "But you have cultivated wickedness and harvested a thriving crop of sins." If you're regularly late to work, if you habitually have a bad attitude, it's likely you're not going to get promoted when promotion time comes around. If you sow seeds of lust and porn and don't spend time building an intimate relationship, it's likely that your relationship is going to suffer. If you eat anything you want, if you never exercise, if you drink a six-pack on the weekend, well, you're not going to have a six-pack ab. You're going to have a 2-liter ab. This is not God punishing you. This is just the natural outcome of your decisions multiplied over a consistent long time. So if you don't like what you're reaping, change what you're sowing. All right, the first law of sowing and reaping is that you reap what you sow. Here's the second. You reap more than you sow. What you sow, God multiplies. Jesus tells the story about a farmer who sows seed on a bunch of different kinds of soil, and he says this: "The seed that fell on good soil represents those who hear and accept God's word and produced a harvest of 30, 60, or even 100 times as much as had been planted." Here's the amazing thing about a seed. If you plant a seed, it doesn't just have in it a future tree. It has a future tree with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of apples over many, many years. And in that seed is the potential for an entire orchard and orchards upon orchards. You see, that seed multiplies. Your closest relationships, your closest friends are multipliers. They take the good that you have and they multiply it. But the opposite is true as well. If you hang around with people who take the bad in you and multiply that, it'll multiply to a whole orchard of, well, rottenness. In his book, The Compound Effect, Darren Hardy says that small, smart choices plus consistency plus time equals a radical difference. All right, let me tell you about two guys in two different scenarios. The first guy sows unwisely. He's stressed and he comes home from work stressed each night, and he decides to help him with his own stress to drink a glass of wine each night to manage the stress. Now that glass of wine is 125 calories. That's like an average glass of wine. Now another guy who sows wisely also comes home and is stressed, but instead of deciding to drink a glass of wine, he decides to go on a walk around the block in his neighborhood, and it's about a mile walk, and he burns in 1 mile about 125 calories. Now remember, you reap more than you sow. So let's multiply this glass of wine over several years. If you take it over 2 years, this is like really concrete. If you take it over 2 years, that 125 calories extra a day turns into about 100,000 calories, which results in a gain of weight of about 28 pounds. Now that was the guy who sowed unwisely, but the guy who sowed wisely didn't just not take in 125 calories, he took off 125 calories, so he lost 28 pounds. That means that's a 56-pound difference between the guy who sowed wisely and the guy who sowed unwisely. Now, I know a little something about this because I could be the unwise guy last year. The beginning of last year, I was going through something pretty stressful, and I stress ate about 30 pounds onto my body in about 3 or 4 months. 30 pounds in 3 or 4 months. That was a lot of stress eating I was doing. I mean, the results, the seeds that are sown and the fruit that is, well, reaped from it, it's really concrete when you think about it in this way. That was the impact physically. Let's talk about the impact financially, because to buy all of that wine, you're down about $2,100. On the other hand, the guy who takes a walk instead of drinking a glass of wine to reduce his stress, takes that $2,100, invests it at 10%, and in 2 years gains about $2,500. which is about a $5,000 difference between the two guys. But if you multiply it out over several years, then it's like $25,000 difference, just all over one glass of wine each night. You reap more than you sow. All right, that was physically, which is really concrete, and financially, which is really concrete. But let's talk about relationally, which is a little more subjective. I get it. But the guy who sows unwisely ends up, relying on the glass of wine to reduce stress rather than investing in his marriage. And in doing so, put some distance between him and his partner. It reminds me of what my dad used to tell me about marriage. He said, there's no coasting. You're either growing together or you are growing apart. Now, on the other hand, the guy who sows wisely decides to invite his partner to walk around the block with him. And in doing so, they talk about the stress and they go closer in their marriage or relationship. You reap more than you sow. Let's talk about it spiritually. Again, this is a little subjective, but the guy who drinks the wine at night, it helps him fall asleep, but alcohol takes a while to digest and get into your bloodstream, and he wakes up and has a restless night and then doesn't sleep very well, and his sort of spiritual habits in the morning, they suffer. The guy who sows wisely, though, grows closer to his spouse. They decide to, at the end of the day, hold hands in bed and just pray briefly about that stress. He gets a better night's sleep, wakes up in the morning, has time and energy to pray, and feels comfortable in the morning because he's well rested to go to church. Here's a key takeaway from this example. It's not what you do occasionally, it's what you do consistently. And if you don't like what you're reaping, then change what you're sowing. Say, yes, I will. And at any time, the unwise sower could change behaviors and reap a better outcome. I mean, since I put on all that weight, I have since taken off half of it. I'm about 15 pounds down, and I'm aiming for the 15 pounds to come off in the next several months. Here's another question for you to reflect on. Put your answer in the comments or turn to your neighbor. When have you seen a small habit add up to a big positive or negative effect in your life over time? Let's talk about it. All right, we've been talking about the law of sowing and reaping. First, you reap what you sow. Second, you reap more than you sow. And third, you reap after you sow. You reap in a different season than you sow. If you sow in the spring, you're not going to reap in the spring. You're going to reap in the fall. Why do we get discouraged? Well, it's because we don't see immediate results. It takes time. It takes patience. If you pray 5 days straight and you still don't feel close to God, keep doing it. 5 days isn't that much. Remember, you reap at a different time than you sow. Or if you go to the gym every day for 2 weeks straight and you still don't see much difference, keep going. You reap after you sow. You don't buy special coffee every single day and you save $100 and you put that towards your debt. Now you're $100 less in debt. I mean, it's still not that much compared to the mountain of debt you have. And so we wrongly conclude that small decisions don't matter that much. But our lives are the sum total of all the decisions we make. Our lives are the sum total of all of the decisions that we make. Or let's go back to C.S. Lewis again in Mere Christianity. Here's what he says. Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God, and with its fellow creatures and with itself. In every action that you are taking, you are choosing a direction. That's why you don't so much want to focus on just accomplishing that big goal. You want to focus on the process that's keeping you going in the direction of that goal. Don't focus on the goal. Focus on the process of staying in the direction. We've talked through this series about who you want to become, your habits that you want to build, the habits you want to break, not trying, but training. All of these things lead to a question. Am I successful when I get that dream? When I get that big goal, then I'm successful. But that's the wrong way to think about it. Don't judge the success of the day by the harvest that you reap, but by the seeds that you sow. Don't be deceived. God can't be mocked. You reap what you sow. You reap more than you sow. You reap after you sow. Your hard work, your discipline, your sacrifices, your habits, they're not being wasted if you're not seeing immediate results. They're being stored up. You can think about it like this. If ice is, let's say, 25 degrees and you warm it up 1 degree, it hasn't yet melted. You warm it up another degree, it hasn't yet melted. Another degree hasn't yet melted. But once you hit that magic number of 32, 33 degrees, you hit a tipping point and the ice begins to melt into a puddle of water. It goes from a solid to a liquid. Now, while it's warming up and while you're doing all of the energy to warm it up 1 degree at a time, that energy, it's not being wasted. It's being stored for a future harvest. I've experienced the same thing with trying to take off these 30 pounds that I put on stress eating. I can do all of the healthy habits. I can get to the gym. I can eat well and not really see much change on the scale. But then all of a sudden, there'll be like some tipping point and I'll go through 1 or 2 pounds, well, really quickly. Sometimes when you see people who have like accomplished that goal and it looks like they had overnight success. But they didn't have overnight success. They weren't lucky. It was small, consistent habits, sacrifices over time. You just saw the 1 degree change that moved or changed from a solid to a liquid. You didn't see the struggle, the time, the patience, 1 degree at a time, storing up for that future harvest. What they don't see is you struggling and staying the path and feeling tempted to quit and praying for God's strength and wondering if God was there, but sticking with it and sticking with it and sticking with it and finding a team and finding friends and supporters and family and praying to God and going back to God and back to God and back to God until finally, you see those results. You see that fruit of the harvest. It's the things that no one sees that lead to the results that everyone wants. So let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. It's not easy. It's not overnight, but you will reap what you sow. So say with me, I will. I will. Here's one final chat question. When have you seen results from your consistent habits much later than you had hoped for? Let's talk about it.